Derry. Thank you. Excellent. Now can we have our final speaker, Mr. Craig Murray. Craig, as I'm sure many of you know, was a former ambassador to Uzbekistan until he blew the whistle on the CIA rendition, extra-rendition flights and torture. I think did Jack Straw sack on the grounds of you were paying too much attention to human rights. That's right. I think you'd wear that as a badge of honour. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you. I quite liked it when I was sitting there. I felt like a 5-year-old because the screen came down just low enough, just below my eye level, so I could imagine you couldn't see me drinking my Guinness, which was... I'm not going to stand here drinking a Guinness because that would look bad, so I'm going to stand here drinking a very large Jameson's. We all relate to where we came from, and while we are an extremely distinguished panel of speakers, and with the odd exception, none of us are quite as young as we were. And I think that actually says something, because I'm viewed now as somebody on the hard left of politics, as I'm constantly told. I don't think my views have changed since I was 18 years old. When I was 18 years old, I believed that the state should own all the natural monopolies. So the state should own the public utilities. I believed in those days, I believed in ending apartheid, which thankfully happened. I believed in justice for Palestine, which hasn't happened. I had a whole set of political beliefs which were entirely mainstream and placed me directly in the centre of politics. Believing nowadays that the state should own the public utilities suddenly makes you on the hard left. And I honestly don't think my politics have changed much over the years, and I've moved from being a liberal to being a communist without changing my belief in anything, which is very, very, very strange. But we're all, we're all prisoners of our past, and my past was very much as a servant of the British state. I joined the Foreign Office straight from university. I went around the world. I was sometimes quite proud of the things I did for the British state, and perhaps in some ways I was naive. And when I got to Uzbekistan, where I found that we were involved in propping up an absolutely hideous dictatorship because of the military advantages it gave us in terms of access to military bases for the war on neighbouring Afghanistan. And when I saw the lies we were telling about weapons of mass destruction in order to invade Iraq, and by chance I used to be the head of the Foreign Office section which did surveillance on Iraqi weapons procurement, so I knew we were lying. I bumped into a chap called Bill Patey, who like me was from Dundee University. And Bill Patey at that time was the head of a Middle Eastern department. And it was 1 week after, or Near East and North Africa, I think it was called, 1 week after the dossier on weapons of mass destruction had been published. And Bill had been one of the people who'd signed off on it. And I said to him, I said, Bill, did something happen I didn't know about after I left the embargo surveillance centre? It can't be true, this dossier, is it? And he just looked at me and laughed, and he said, no, of course not, it's bollocks. And Sir William Patey went on to become ambassador to Iraq and ambassador to Afghanistan. And he, like so many worthy Foreign Office people, turned up to the Chilcot report and gave very damning evidence that the whole thing was a fabrication. But none of them actually stopped it when it was happening, even though they knew it was wrong and it was illegal. And that's the scary thing. And they're not bad people. I mean, it comes down to the banality of evil and good people doing bad things. I found as ambassador in Uzbekistan, the things I was asked to do, which were going along in particular with signing off on intelligence which was obtained from torture, I found that so bad I couldn't do it. My conscience wouldn't allow me to do it, so I ended up having a big fight with the Foreign Office, and I ended up effectively getting sacked. I then became a whistleblower and went off, published a book, went round on a speaking tour around the UK, talking to nice audiences of sort of middle-class British people like myself about the lies and the torture and the crimes that the government was involved in. And by and large, they were shocked. And people were shocked to hear an eyewitness account from the inside of those things. And I remember, and it was very successful in a way. I remember I went to Malvern. I went to the town of Malvern, somewhere I'd never been before, which has a very big old theatre in it. And they'd sold 800 tickets at £7 a ticket for people to come and listen to me talk. I have no idea where that money went, incidentally. None of it came to me. But there were 800 people who'd come to hear me. And they were almost all nice, middle-class British people who'd come to be shocked about how evil Jack Straw and Tony Blair came. They were shocked. They shared my shock. Then a few years ago, I got invited here to speak at the West Belfast Festival. And I gave my talk, and I said the British government lies, and the British government tortures people, and the British government kills people. And of course, nobody was shocked at all. Because what to me had come as a shock was what people had lived with their entire lives and what they'd seen happen to their family and their friends. And they knew people who'd been tortured by the British government. They knew people who'd been killed by the British government. And they knew that the British government continually lies and cheats about what happens. So I think, my intentions and my motivation was as good as the people in the audience. It's just they knew long before I knew because of their life experience. And that made me cheery of coming here to Belfast and trying to tell people about how awful the world is, because I think many people here know a lot better than me. But I was recalling also, back then, shortly after I left the office, I went on a speaking tour of the United States with Brigadier General Janice Karpinski, who had been the most senior female officer in the US Army and who had been in charge of Abu Ghraib at the time that all the torture was happening. And she said, and I have no reason to disbelieve her, I do believe her, that the actual torture happened. Although she was officially in charge of the establishment, there was a block, there was an area of the establishment into which she wasn't allowed at all. Although she was commanding officer, she was not allowed in there. But she did know more or less what happened there. And she said she had on her wall an order on enhanced interrogation techniques signed by Donald Rumsfeld himself. The advanced interrogation techniques means torture, basically. And she said Donald Rumsfeld, and she said the order detailed the forms of torture used at Abu Ghraib, including waterboarding, and it bore Donald Rumsfeld's own signature. And the Bloody Sunday decision on prosecution reminded me of that, because although Donald Rumsfeld had signed off the order, only one person was ever jailed for the torture at Abu Ghraib, and they chose a common soldier and blamed it all on him and put him in prison. And not one officer, not Donald Rumsfeld, not one officer in the chain of command was jailed or blamed, which is exactly what we're seeing in the Bloody Sunday prosecution. The state pretends that the state isn't culpable and the politicians aren't culpable and the officers aren't culpable. And it could well be. I'm not saying that the soldier at Abu Ghraib, he quite probably was an extremely bad person if he was involved in doing that torture. And it could well be that whoever's being prosecuted over Bloody Sunday is an extremely bad person. But they are not the only one. And I think the idea that justice is served by picking out one person from the bottom of the pile and placing all the blame on him is an anathema. And I think it's an absolute disgrace that that's what we're saying. We mentioned Pat Finucane. We're seeing this tide of Russophobia, which has been mentioned, by several of the speakers. And the idea that Russia is now being elevated again. So it always has to be an enemy to justify the vast spending on the military, on the armaments industry, and on the security services, particularly now on the security services, which are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and have to justify their budgets. In the House of Commons, in the papers, much has been made of a bunch of allegedly mysterious deaths of various Russian oligarchs in the UK. But very little is ever said in the UK newspapers about the deaths of people like Pat Finucane, and it doesn't stop there. We're going to start investigating mysterious deaths. I still want to know who killed David Kelly. I still want to know who killed Willie McRae of the SNP. I still want to know who killed Hilda Morell, the anti-nuclear campaigner. There are plenty of mysterious deaths we can look at in which I have very, very little doubt the United Kingdom security services were involved. We saw the case of the young man from MI6 who managed to kill himself and then zip himself up in a holdall and put himself in the bath, which was sad, but a ludicrous story accepted by the media. And what the media will accept is quite astonishing. And I'm not actually today going to talk about all the things that the media accept about the Skripal story, which are obviously physical impossibilities. That would be great fun, but it would be another meeting all to itself. I'm thinking of imperialism. I'm always reminded of the historian J.A. Hobson and his book on imperialism. And it was Hobson who first said that it was quite wrong to consider that the British Empire made the British people rich on the back of their colonies. They didn't. The British Empire actually impoverished the British working man. What it made wealthy was the British military and political class. And it funneled the money to them, but that the ordinary British working man would have been much better benefited from a peaceful world. I think that's absolutely true. And we can see it now. I mean, one of the things which I find absolutely astonishing, I find it astonishing that I live in a country where there are now, according to the Financial Times, last year, the Financial Times said for the first time there are more than 100 billionaires in the United Kingdom. And the Financial Times thought that was something to celebrate. And we have more than 100 billionaires in the UK at a time when we have over 1 million children living in poverty, according to the United Nations. That's not something to celebrate. That is absolutely disgusting. That is absolutely disgusting. We have a nation that feels it can waste hundreds of millions of pounds on weapons of mass destruction, on Trident missiles, going into cost of billions. And nobody knows how many billion, for certain. And Trident is of no use. In no political crisis of the last 30 years has anyone said Trident missiles are the answer to it, or Polaris missiles are the answer to it. They're actually of no practical use whatsoever. They're part of the continued need for, as Peter said, punching above our weight. The idea that Britain is some kind of global superpower, when plainly it is not. It is a country which has come to the end of its course of a global power, to the extent I think it's come to the end of its own existence. One thing I was saying that when I came here before to the West Belfast Festival, I was surprised by people's lived experience of being on the receiving end of the horrors of the British state. I was also slightly surprised by how little support there was for Scottish independence, because I spend a lot of my time campaigning for Scottish independence, because whereas in Scotland, a great many of us see ourselves as having been oppressed by the English for centuries, in West Belfast, a great many people see themselves as having been oppressed by the Scots for centuries, and with some justification, because by some fortunate accident, the Ulster Scots, many of whom come from a very strange political and religious tradition, we managed to get rid of and deposit on you.
Might take my back.
No, I think they wouldn't really help. But I think the United Kingdom has run its course, in effect, as a political institution. There's no doubt whatsoever that the politics of Scotland are not just more left-wing, more humane, less authoritarian, more communal. We don't look down at Tory England and see anything we have in common. Just for many of us, the political culture of England now, in particular the stirring up of racism we see there, and the anti-immigrant rhetoric being adopted right across the political parties and right across the media. And I mean, fair play to Jeremy Corbyn for standing against it, but he has everything against him in doing that. We don't see that as representing the kind of society to which we wish to feel allied. And I think we are at a stage now, we've seen the British Empire disintegrate down, and this desperate attachment, this increased militarism, there is now far less tolerance of dissent from the militaristic agenda than there has been at any stage in my lifetime. And indeed, than even there was in the heyday of empire. One quote I like to give is during Britain's now made 4 failed attempts to invade Afghanistan and lost every time. During the 3rd Afghan War, I think, in 1880, Gladstone, who was at the time leader of the opposition, Gladstone made a speech advocating pulling out British troops from Afghanistan. And in his speech, he said that the Afghans were justified in fighting British troops as invaders. And what he said is, he said, the humble hearth of the Afghan is as sacred as your own. We have thrown their wives and children into the snows of winter. If they resist, would you not do the same? Would you not do the same? And of course you would. If foreigners came into your country and threw you out into the snow, you would resist with violence. And you would, in my view, I'm not a pacifist, you would be justified in resisting with violence. And Gladstone actually won that election and became Prime Minister. Can you imagine what would happen if Jeremy Corbyn stood up and said that people fighting British troops in Afghanistan are justified in doing so because we are invaded? He would be, he'd be chucked out of his job. He would be calumniated. It is now impossible for anybody to make that kind of case and say anybody fighting British troops can be justified. The British media would be united 100% in condemning that person. They would be subject to a storm of vilification. And yet, even at the height of the British Empire, when it was at its greatest extent, Gladstone could say that as leader of the opposition and win an election. We are less liberal and less open and less fair-minded now than people were even at the height of empire. And we have lost, we're talking about the state, we have lost our sight of the state's capacity for good. The state has the ability to mobilize massive resources, yet it only ever does it for bad. Or we saw, for example, incredible amounts of money mobilized to bail out the banks. It was the equivalent, I think, of £18,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United Kingdom, given to save the banks from the consequences of their own reckless gambling, because that's what all this derivatives trading and subprime mortgage swaps was gambling. The government could find money to the tune of 18,000 quid per head of the population to bail out the banks. And yet, we don't have a state that can stop kids going hungry. The state has become a force which is controlled purely for the benefit of a few. And the fact that the wealth gap is growing so enormously, it's not natural. It's not the natural operation of free market economics. It's to do with the forms of regulation and law enforced by the state, which enable that kind of wealth accumulation and which prevent ordinary people from getting the benefit of their labour. We are losing the idea of the state as a force for good. We're also losing sight of the role of altruism in society. I was rector of Dundee University for a while. I was horrified by a number of developments in the university sector. For one thing, I couldn't understand why the vice-chancellor of the rector was on £325,000 a year. And the way that universities now function as corporations, and the idea that he had to be on that because that's what the head of a chemical company is on. The idea that people in senior positions in education, in healthcare, in whatever field they're in, won't do it for anything but money, that everybody is motivated by nothing but money. The way that idea has seeped through society, so that you now have, on £325,000 a year, he was getting less than Save the Children. The head of Save the Children, the chief executive of Save the Children, gets more than that. I think £375,000 a year, and that's meant to be a charity. You have little old ladies working in shops, giving their time and effort for nothing to get pennies off people, to put money in for Save the Children. And then you have people at the top taking vast salaries. We have lost the idea that people work for altruism. We live in a society in which the organization of it is based upon the idea that what everybody wants and what everybody should want is to accumulate more stuff, to own more things, to have more money, as opposed to live the good life, looking after and caring for their neighbours. We live in a system where people are not satisfied. And we've seen a massive reaction against this. People understand that the organisation of society doesn't fulfil even the physical needs of a very large section of the population, while other people are engaged in this ever more greedy accumulation of wealth. And we see a populist reaction against that. And what we've seen, particularly in England, is the way that the media, by its united front and its suppression of other views, can frustrate and divert the understandable anger of people. So the fact that you don't have money and the fact that you're on a 0 hours contract and you're working very, very hard but your kids still don't get enough to eat, it's not the fault of the guy who's worth £8 billion who owns a company you work for. It's actually the fault of that immigrant over there because he's got a job too. And the diversion of societal discontent onto the weakest of society and away from the strongest in society who actually cause the inequality is, for me, the most glaring feature of the modern state taken as a whole, the modern state being that combination of politicians and the media, and the stores of wealth where we are controlled. I think that's enough for now. As I hope I've said, every time I come here, I end up learning more than I can tell. So I hope to talk to you all a bit more later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. Well, that concludes this